This is Bob Harding. I'm bringing you another section of the Sunday afternoon lecture series from the Dartmouth Historical and Arts Society. Today's speaker is Claude Ledoux. Claude was talking on a sequence of topics having to do with agriculture in the South Coast region over different periods of time. Claude speaking with us is one example of our collaborative association of local history and genealogy champions. He comes from Westport and is very seasoned TV producer, having produced hundreds of programs over the last several decades called Westport Matters. You can reach those through our website as it links into the Westport Historical Society website. Thank you for coming. There'll be more after this.
Good evening. I'm Claude Ledoux from Westport, and I'm going to give you a lecture on the Northeast American Indian agriculture in pre-colonial times. This is one of three parts about local agriculture over the centuries. I want to thank the Dartmouth Community TV for giving me access to this beautiful facility so we can present this to you in a proper manner. Today is the 21st of March, 2017. Previously, I have given a lecture at the Russell's Mill School in 2015, which was a lecture about 20th century farming during the World War II times. Farming was at the peak of the number of family farms in the country. Since then, it's been followed by a fairly precipitous farm decline. In Westport, that decline was triggered by the advent of Westport Route 88, which knifed through many farms and changed the whole makeup of the farming environment in Westport. That is a standalone subject, which someday we might get a chance to look at that. Okay. The local Northeast American agriculture in colonial times is a more precise title. The Indian period was followed by the colonial and national periods, which marked a big difference between the Indian agriculture of shared lands and the following agricultural processes involved private land ownership, which was during the colonial and national eras. Those eras would be a separate subject of their own and would be part of the three-part series. Today, though, we will concentrate on the Indian period called Northeast Woodlands culture. It was about 12,000 years long and occupied a very large area of the country. New England, and even included the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway. Okay. So briefly, we look at the origins of the Indians which populated this area. We call them Indians to this day. There would be more appropriate names, but this is a more common reference. About 30,000 years ago, the Americas were devoid of humans. So we have to ask ourselves, how did humans come to populate the Americas? Well, as is pretty well known, the migrants from the Asian areas of which is now Russia migrated across land bridges in the Bering Sea area. The Ice Age caused ocean levels to drop tremendously and exposed land bridges between the two continents. So the migrations of humans from those areas started about 30,000 years ago, and they came in successive waves almost all the way back to 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago was the warmest time in the last ice age cycle. So this was kind of shut off the land bridges because the ocean rose again, and that kind of closed that avenue. By that time, we had many successive migrations to this country. Now, one of the big things that happened with these people coming across, migrating to this continent, was that they brought fire with them. And this too gave them dominance over species that already had existed here. So a short recap, the period of exodus to the Americas was during the last ice age of our planet. I want to note here, and because the ice ages had a lot to do, especially the last ice age, had a lot to do with the people migrating throughout the world. There is concrete evidence of many cooling and warming events during the last million years of our planets. 4 events were during the last 500,000 years. Okay, we'll go to the next one. Global cooling. I'm going to spend a little time on this ice age, icy cooling events, and because it's important. It created total change in the makeup of the planet. It affected populations all over the world, and also the animals and vegetation. So global cooling and warming periods are caused regularly by variations in the Earth's orbital elliptical curve. And those changes affect the cooling and warming of the planet. These changes cause worldwide adaptations to global animal, vegetative, and human migrations. Big changes. These cycles have been called Milankovitch cycles. So the global warming and cooling are natural cycles. They have occurred at about 100,000 year intervals, and roughly 80 to 90,000 cooling years. They are followed by about 10 to 20,000 years of warming. The warmest point of warming during the last cycle, which is the one we're on, the Holocene period, was about 10,000 years ago. Since then, there has been a cooling trend in the planet. There's the exception with this cycle compared to all the previous ones is that starting at around 1750, the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere has increased by a large amount, due mainly to the burning of fossil fuels on the planet. This has caused an unnatural warming increase, which we are experiencing presently. There are some good references that I'll mention that you can look up to clear up more mystery about all of this stuff. One reference for these cycles is Google Earth open source systems. And I'm going to show you some parts of voluminous information that you can get. I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to give a couple of highlights. We are now in an ice age progression, but we're not at the stage where it has started to warm up the Antarctic ice or the Greenland ice cap. Those are still intact at this time. During the last ice age, a very startling fact surprised me. The ice thickness was 12,000 feet in this area. We were on the edge of it here, which dropped sea levels by about 400 feet worldwide. That's about a 2.5 miles high ice cap, if you can visualize that. The outcome of the recent ice age, you can imagine, was a change in evolution, not only of humans, but the evolution of Homo sapiens, which is what we are, changed tremendously during this cycle. And also, it changed the composition and the evolution of many other species, as vegetative as well as animal. Another voluminous piece of info is the global warming cycle that you can also Google. And this is, I think this is a 14-page system that is very thorough with graphs. I hope that shows up all right. But if you want to do that, dig out more info of that type, Google the global warming natural cycles. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. The significant outcome of the recent ice age was the improved development of our species. New territories, new game species, new lifestyles changed the makeup of our civilization. Tool and clothing development, migration over new land bridges, mastery over fire, all of those milestones really changed the way we are. The fire provided a better nourishment from cooking, which led to increased brain power. All of these changes led to an evolution of civilization and a gradual change to sedentary lifestyles, which was enabled by the development of agricultural and domestication techniques. The sedentary lifestyle was a gradual movement, change of life cycles, because that had to be accompanied by agriculture. The hunting and gathering was not as successful as that. A brief summary is that the Ice Age migrations resulted in a northeast habitation by Paleo-Indians, which is the scientific term, about 12,000 years ago. They were the descendants of nomadic migrants who crossed the Beringia land bridges between 30 and 10,000 years ago in successive waves. Those successive waves, by the way, it's important to note that most of them used the corridor between the mountains and the ice sheet and moved south, more warmer to the warmer climates. They kept going, and the successive waves that came were always had to fight their way against the people that were already established. So by the time the last waves came, the people kind of had to stay in the northern latitudes around the polar ice cap, and those became the people we call the Eskimos, and the right term is the Inuits. So the stratification of civilization was dictated by the limitation of moving into new territories by the successive waves, which weren't strong enough and not established to fight civilizations that had already grown. Or try the next one. So the local end product of primitive hunter-gatherers, continental migrations, eventually developed into a stratified land and national divisions of both of the American continents. This would be, you could almost term this as a nation-building divisions, which occurred over a long period of time, over the 12,000 years or more. And things got sorted out where certain people with certain traits, certain language, would have a pretty big piece of land. And although there might have been skirmishes around the edges, it became impossible almost for one nation to control the other, because there wasn't enough time in the year or enough resources to mount a campaign, a conquering campaign of that type. So the stratification and divisions became fairly well established and pretty well unchangeable. The hunter-gatherer inhabitants brought control of fire. We made a point of that already. It's a discovery of African hominids about 300,000 years ago. Fire provided the ability to transform their environment. Fire, coupled with their inventiveness, shaped their evolution in food production, hunting, weapons, government and lifestyles, trading of goods and ideas, environmental control. A good example of environmental control is still visible not too far from here. If you go to the Great Barrens in Maine, down east, used for low bush blueberry production, you see these giant areas burned every other year. They'll burn one area, next year they'll harvest the blueberries, the year after they burn it again, and so on. And that's still going on. It's a big production of these sweet little blueberries. Worth checking out. If you could Google that and find out more information. So as a result of all of this evolutionary cycle, the first white settlers came to a world that had been modified to suit the Indian populations. It was not a primeval environment populated by savages. It was a world shaped by fire, populated by varied civilizations, which were well adapted to their individual locations on a continent. After 12 millennia, hunter-gatherer Paleo-Indians had evolved into a successful subsistence, a territorial lifestyle where foodstuffs were largely provided by an evolutionary derived agriculture. This was accompanied by hunting techniques suited to their environment. In addition, fishing, gathering from the waters, rivers and brooks, and a wide variety of plants which had been nurtured from a slash and burn agriculture provided the nourishment of a healthy diet. Writings of the first whites described the natives as strong, healthy, vigorous, and mentally alert, in harmony with their environment. Short recap: the events that promoted intensive agriculture and the forsaking of nomadism are worth noting. One of them was pottery development for cooking and food storage pits. Trading, about 1,000 years AD, agricultural ideas from the Ohio Valley trade dramatically changed food growing. This valley was at a major river's crossroads used for trading. You can visualize the Mississippi, Ohio rivers and all of their tributaries. Waterways were intercontinental trade routes, and those rivers were of intercontinental makeup. So the trade routes established by this river system changed civilizations somewhat, but also changed the food growing because people kept interchanging ways of doing this, ways of managing it. The stores of maize ended hand-to-mouth living and tied people to the land. Increased food supply promoted population growth and better ways of life. This minimized the need for having to conquer other territories to get food. So the social and political ideas developed because of the more sedimentary lifestyles, and this marked further steps to civilization and well-defined social governance. The main nation of our northeast woodlands was Algonquin. They were one of the most populous native North American language groups, prominent along the Atlantic coast, St. Lawrence Valley, and the Great Lakes. Algonquin villages were the basic social units. They moved to summer and winter quarters nearer food supplies, with winter shelters being more permanent. They had well-organized governmental structures with leadership generally granted by popular agreement. Algonquins were the local residents. They were part of the Huron Nation. National boundary disputes national boundaries disputes of the separate nations were fairly minimal. As I stated before, there would be around the edges some skirmishes, but mounting a campaign against a whole nation would just be impossible the way things were. There were no machine guns. So the Indian life regimen was very central to food production. Their whole life was centered on food, producing enough food to keep the people alive and healthy. Food growing varied with the seasons. Village locations moved accordingly. There's a lot of info here, but the first part is food from the waters. In the springtime, you see where there's a tremendous amount of different types of sea life. Some of the writings of the whites say that you could wade in water about a foot or two, a few feet, and gather lobsters by hand. There was whale hunting, porpoises and seals at sea. Women and children tended the gardens and gathered scallops, mussels, clams, and crabs. They used some fish as fertilizer, as well been documented. So then we go from April through October. You had food from the air: migratory birds, eggs, geese, doves, and also passenger pigeon was one of the pretty numerous species. Wild plants, July, August. Now these wild plants would have been, to some degree, cultivated using slash and burn agriculture. Agriculture per se during the summer would be for above ground crops. Corn was about 65% of their diet. Beans, squash, and tobacco for pleasure was also planted. Hunting, fall, early winter, they moved to the forest to hunt beavers, deer, moose, and caribou. Men did the hunting, heavy work, and warfare. Winter was living off the storage foods, cached foods. And finally, slash and burn agriculture has to be singled out as the 1 or 2 years of cultivation, and that would mean that it would be they moved from one growing area to the other during the summer months. It was a sustainable agriculture, self-regenerating, and the English that came essentially found the region ready for planting. The big stones had not been removed, but there was plenty of land that had been farmed, and it was ready to be taken over. This diet increased the population density to 287 persons per square 100 miles. This was opposed to 41 persons per 100 square miles for hunter-gathering societies. A couple of quick notes. Maize in South America became common use about 6,300 years ago, whereas in the southeastern New England, where we are, it started, growing corn started around 1,000 years ago. A good example of agricultural evolution is that over the millennia, the Indians had empirically discovered symbiosis of companion plantings. A widely known and used combination of corn, beans, and squash was termed the Three Sisters. Those three plants are complementary to each other, and these combinations started in South America about 5,000 years ago. Corn was planted first, followed by beans a couple of weeks later, and then accompanied by squash a little bit later. Corn provided the structure for growing the beans. Beans grew up the corn stalks, and scientifically unknown to the Indians, the beans fixed nitrogen to the soil and provided a good protein source while benefiting from the corn shade. Squash produced ground cover and acted as living mulch to prevent weed growth and conserve moisture. There were and are many other companion planting combinations that optimize crop yields. I'm going to just mention right now that you can do some more Googling, and if you Google Native American net roots, you will find about a half a dozen pages of very useful information referencing slash and burn and companion plantings. All of this is too much to cover in one lecture, but if you feel like you might want to know more, use the Google Avenue and Google Native American net roots for more info. Okay, the next slide is an example of the Three Sisters, showing the beans, squash, corn combinations. Next slide. Before I go into that one, the Three Sisters, by the way, can also be Googled in Wikipedia info. You Google Three Sisters Agriculture in Wikipedia, and you'll end up with a lot more great information as far as the nourishment and some more technical stuff. Okay, there's a short list of the documented Indian plantings: pumpkins, squashes, sunflowers, Jerusalem artichoke, small black plums. How many of you can remember or know about these small beach plums that you can gather along the beach during the fall? Corn varieties of different colors, kidney beans, and wild plants which were not cultivated but grew such as fern fiddleheads. Okay, I'm going to show you another document that I would like to pass on to someone that wanted to do more research in Indian agricultural plants and cultivation. This is a 60-page, double-sided document written a long time ago by Professor Gordon DeWolf Jr. from the Arnold Arboretum. So I'm going to pass this on to someone that can use it more than I can. It's a beautiful, very thorough document that covers the technicalities and the variety of the Indian agricultural plants and cultivation. Okay, next slide. The success achieved by all those measures was pretty evident that as a measure of colonial success of the Indians, pre-colonial Indians, scholars estimated that in 1600, the native population of New England was between 70 and 100,000 persons. Next slide. The bottom line is that the white newcomers were coming to well-established civilized cultures in all of the Americas. In many respects, some of those cultures were better than many other world civilizations of the time. In our area, native demise came about by the incremental destructions of the natives with diseases and other trading moose skins for territory and stuff like that. Conversion of their common lands to private white ownership was a plainful travail. This is in contrast to the fate of the northern natives of Quebec's St. Lawrence and Great Lakes, colonized by French explorer Champlain, where the natives were treated as equals. They fared much better, but eventually fell prey to the white diseases due to lack of immunity. This is explained in a recent book, Champlain's Dream. If you're interested, it's a great book. And in French, it's Le Rêve de Champlain, if you'd rather have it that way. Okay, I want to mention that there's a farmer on Division Road who died a couple of years ago, Ernie Waite. He might be known to a lot of you people. I have assembled a little book together about him. He was a good friend and taught me a lot. Ernie was the last of Westport's working old Yankee farmers. His lifetime was from 1918 to 2013. Worked his way through some tremendous handicaps, and he was a master of self-sustaining farming and animal husbandry, a tradesman, horseman, sawmiller, survivor, and a lifelong smoker. All right, we go to the next slide. Following the Indian agriculture, the new farm era was the colonial period followed by the national period. And that warrants its own talk, which I've got that pretty well prepared. So the eras that eventually progressed farm methods to the agricultural peak of the 1950s, a few at that time still using hay ricks. I don't know how many of you can remember hay ricks. There weren't many left in my youth, but they were quite a good way to store your hay for the winter. Sadly, in my book, the symbiosis between humans, horses, and oxen of these eras is now lost. The 1950s farm diversity peaked. Chicken, vegetable, pig farms existed all throughout the area, anchored by loose hay, manure cellar barns of dairy farms. That's a unique way to manage dairy cattle, and it was very popular in this area until it got converted to open barn type farming. Many of those farms of the 50s still use horses for tending the lands and doing general work. So lastly would be this era, since the 80s or so. Our present situation is of fallow, forested lands with only a few farms that provide a profitable livelihood for the owners. And our foods, mostly mass-produced, come from foreign or other parts of our country. The days, the farming is, that one I remember vividly because of having been involved in it, was during the 50s when, during the fall, late summer, fall months, the women would be busy preserving the food in jars, and that food lasted a long time and provided very good nourishment for a long period of time. So finally, this Claude Ledoux, I want to thank you very much for giving me this time in this beautiful studio. I hope I haven't bored you too much. I'm a French Canuck immigrant at the age of 13 in 1949, and I was lucky enough to have lived through these last transitions of farming. And finally, just a picture of some of my things I like to do. That's it. I want to thank you all very much. Thank you to Dammit Cable Access TV, Cable TV, for providing this avenue to bring this information to you. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.